The topic of Def Leppard recording guitar parts one string at a time can easily be misunderstood as an example of overproduction and self-indulgence. Criticisms often used for that era of music production. But even back in the 1980s, I could imagine this topic being thought of as some sort of weird rumour or urban myth, one where the demands of the ultra-precise and evil Mutt Lange forced the band to record songs one string at a time just to get the desired results. I want to use this video to highlight some examples where this technique is being used, and maybe offer an opinion to justify why it has been used and to what benefit. Hopefully I can help debunk the urban myth opinion, and maybe offer up another reason why albums like Pyromania and Hysteria stand out from that era of rock. The first and main reason I'm going to highlight as to why you may want to record one string at a time is for clarity, and this will mainly cover examples from Pyromania. Now, often when we hear Phil talk about Steve's writing style, he'll mention the use of unusual chords and chord shapes, and this is none more apparent than on Pyromania. And although there are some instances of these chords on earlier albums, it is not until Pyromania that they take the forefront of the music's foundation as opposed to just passing phrases. Before we delve into this a bit more, I just want to go over some musical theory to help make my point, mainly something called harmonic intervals. Now, a harmonic interval is the difference between two pitches in a chord, or to be even more basic, it's the space between two notes. It's referred to by numbers that represent the steps away from the root note. Here, for example, is the third, which is the interval that dictates the major or minor feel in a chord. The perfect fifth gives an open but reinforcing feel with power. So much power, in fact, that for guitarists, this is called the power chord. This is used 90% of the time in rock guitar for numerous reasons. It's easy to play and finger, it's the clearest sounding chord with distortion, and with its open sounding interval, you can't really go wrong with it. You could play it chromatically, step by step, up and down, and it would sound fine. Whereas other chords and intervals require a bit more thought for them to musically fit. Okay, now let's look at two progressions that use the string by string method. First is one of the many bridges in Billy's Got a Gun. And here's the main heavy riff in Coming Under Fire. If we look closer at the harmonic intervals, we'll see that in Billy's Got a Gun, we have a fourth, a minor third, a minor sixth, and a couple of fifths, and a couple of augmented fourths. They can also be called diminished fifths, but don't worry about that too much. And in Coming Under Fire, we have minor thirds, with once again, fifths and augmented fourths. So like most rock, we have the power chord, but unlike most rock, we have everything else in between as well. And this is all over Pyromania. So here we have some context as to why the guitars are recorded string by string. We have some heavy rock guitar that's playing more intricate chord intervals. To compare on how it would sound normally, I've made a little example of how the Billy's Got a Gun progression would sound with a regular guitar overdub. As you can hear, the guitars sound a little muddy. The chords in this overdriven sound produce other harmonic frequencies that are a little inconsistent and they're not really controllable. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but they are definitely not as clean sounding as the power chord. So, do all heavy rock guitars that play intricate chords need to be recorded string by string? Well, no. And even on Pyromania, not all instances of these chords are recorded this way. On Stage Fright and Foolin', these chords sound more traditionally recorded, but I think that's because they are used in passing phrases. The examples in Billy's Got a Gun and Coming Under Fire, they lean on these types of chord intervals and rely on their sound, and it's the same for Too Late for Love. These chords are a focal point, so they need to be heard loud and clear, and the best way to have that much control is to record them string by string. Also, in context with the production style of the album, it would be odd if the guitars were not treated in similar vein to the vocals and drums, with a great attention to detail. There is less use of this technique on hysteria, as there is less of a need to make these chord types sound clearer. The writing and arranging of the music had developed in a way where these chords featured higher up an octave or two in pitch, so they weren't as muddy sounding in the mix. There is one example which I think is similar though, and that is the Armageddon intro. It's recorded string by string, and although it seems odd, I assume it was done for the same purposes of having more control to get it as loud and clear as desired to fit that album's production. So the overall benefit of this recording technique in this instance is that it allows you to prominently use these more complex chord intervals in a heavy setting. But is this why albums like Pyromania and Hysteria are better than others from that era? Well, for me, I would say yes, it is part of it. But I don't think it's right to use terms like better or worse when talking about music. You know, music is very personal. You may agree with me on some of my favourite albums, but you may question a couple of others. So another way to phrase it is that I like to think of these chords as adding a bit of colour to the music. You can make an analogy like this, where power chord bass guitar is like a Mondrian painting, whereas Steve Clark style guitar is like Van Gogh's Starry Night. Both are desirable to look at, and you can make a case for preferring one to the other. But there are a lot of subtle details in Starry Night that are maybe not as desirable on their own, but accentuate the overall piece. And that's like the augmented fourths in Billy's Got a Gun. They add tension that makes the resolve satisfying and interesting. This thematic writing paired with melody creates a sense of depth to the album and more replay value for me personally. It's a writing style that complements the production, and it's a production style that complements the writing. And I don't think that's an example of self-indulgence at all. Okay, so the next section I'm going to look at as to why you would record one string at a time is to enhance. This section and the next will not be as in-depth as the last one, so you can relax a little bit. This part will mainly look at a couple of examples from Hysteria, and it has already been touched upon by Sav in the Classic Albums series, although I think it was maybe in the DVD bonus footage. If you haven't seen that series yet, I do recommend watching it, as it's a great insight into the recording process, although I feel it only covers the tip of the iceberg, especially with Def Leppard. And this has also been mentioned by Phil in a couple of interviews in the last few years as well. The most well-known example is the pre-chorus on Hysteria. One reason that Phil has touched upon before is that Mutt wanted there to be no arpeggiation on that particular chord sound. He wanted all the notes to hit at the same time. This is theoretically impossible to play normally, as when you play a chord, no matter how fast, you will always hit one string first compared to the others. So recording it string by string actually makes sense for this reason. But I think there's another benefit to recording the pre-chorus guitar this way. The guitar is a clean tone, and I think that's a hard tone to make sound big and fit on an album like Hysteria. Layering the guitar with the individual notes creates an orchestration that enhances the sound. I've made a little example so you can hear what it sounds like on its own. So here's a more traditional recorded overdub. And here's what it sounds like string by string. I think you can hear another example of this technique in the opening of Love and Affection. There are chord hits which sound like chimes, and again I think this technique was used to enhance the overall clean sound and just give the opening another texture and kind of like a high-end sheen. Not all the clean guitar on Hysteria had to be recorded this way though. One other technique to get the desired clean guitar chord sound was to tune all the open strings to a certain chord, and I believe you can hear this on Animal. These parts sit further back in the mix, so maybe that explains why this technique was used as opposed to recording it string by string. I think these examples show some cool creativeness and experimentation to get some unique sounds to fit on a unique album. I don't think you'd find many artists or producers willing to spend that much time and effort on such fine details. Okay, now the final reason I'm going to look at as to why you would record one string at a time is because you can't play the part on a single guitar. This is a bit of a stretch, but I thought I'd include it anyway to highlight something interesting about the example itself. So we're going back to Billy's Got a Gun, but this time we're focusing on the opening riff. Now the bracketed 1, which is a D sharp or E flat note, is supposed to instruct that the note is sustained from when it was last played, and the line between the 3 and the 5 represent a slide. Now this is almost impossible to play unless you have big hands, so yeah, it would make sense that this would be recorded string by string. However, this is not exactly what's going on. On a closer listen, there's no sustained note under the slide. The slide happens on its own. However, the nature of the guitar being recorded string by string creates an illusion, well to me anyway, where it sounds like the note is sustained a little. I think this is because if you were to play the riff normally on one guitar, that D sharp or E flat note on the first fret would get cut a little in order to proceed to the slide, or the note would have a little imperfection or slide sound itself. But because that note is perfect, it creates this chord-like illusion for me. So technically, you can play the riff on one guitar, but I don't think you get that same sound. Now live, the band usually plays the riff like this. And they'll leave out the slide. Sometimes you can hear one guitar play the slide, but like I said, I think it lacks the heavy chord sound. You'll find that most people would play it like this, and myself included. And this is how the riff is tabbed in books and online. It integrates a chord sound with the slide, and while again not technically correct, I think it still works. And I think it still works because basically they are inverted fifth chords, and as we learned earlier, they add a chord-like sound without upsetting the musical tonality. I think it would work better with the other guitar playing it the second way as well, to keep that D sharp / E flat note in. This would create a ninth chord feel, which is always something I think sounds pretty cool. So yeah, I think this shows how recording string by string can also create a sense of mystery in the riffs. Again, if I wanted to relate this to paintings, I'd say this is a bit like Impressionism. It maybe suggests things that aren't actually there. Or maybe I've just lost my mind listening to this stuff too much, I don't know. Either way, it's just one of many guitar details that have intrigued me over the years. So I hope this video has given some insight into this recording technique and maybe shown why it was used and to what benefit. You know, when I was trying to learn about all this stuff when I was younger, there was a lack of info out there, and anytime I could find something, it was often ridiculed in certain recording engineer circles. You know, that's why I like to stay away from the whole better or worse terminology. You know, I don't think it helps. And even if you don't like the type of music or the way something is recorded, I think you can always learn something from it. And that's the main aim. Anyway, thanks for watching.